There are still some things that money can't buy. Love, happiness, true friendship. But according to our next guest, the list of things not up for sale these days is getting smaller and smaller. You can pay a surrogate mother in India to carry a pregnancy. Companies can pay a fee to pollute the atmosphere. And in the US, prisoners can now even pay to be upgraded to a better prison cell. Without us hardly noticing it, we've drifted from a market economy to a market society, and that carries consequences for our democracy. So says Harvard professor and philosopher Michael Sandel in his new book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. He's been dubbed in the US the world's first moral rock star, and his lectures around the world has drawn thousands. Last night in Sydney, he filled the Joan Sutherland Theatre at the Sydney Opera House as all part of Sydney Writers' Festival, which has brought him to this country. Michael Sandel joins me in the breakfast studio. Michael, good morning.
Thanks, Frank. Good to be with you.
Michael, in your new book, you give many examples of how the market has encroached into our everyday lives. What, in your view, is the most egregious example, the one you pull out as in lights to demonstrate this?
May I name two? One of
course you can.
One of them is paid line standing. Now, if you want to sit in on a congressional hearing, or more likely if a lobbyist does but doesn't want to stand in the long queue, you can go to a company that will hire homeless people or others to stand in the queue for you. That struck me. That I thought was a pretty astounding use of markets. Another is body advertising. Advertising companies now take out space, commercial advertising space on people's foreheads and bodies, where they offer to pay money if you'll install, in some cases, a permanent tattoo advertising a company. These are two of my, I can't say favorites, but most striking examples.
Now, they're extreme, of course, but your thesis is that they are the extremities, and all through, things have snuck up on us.
Exactly. And in more central, in questions, areas more central to social and civic life, this is happening. Less extreme, but in some ways more fateful. The growing trend toward what some would call mercenary armies outsourcing war to private military companies, as the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there were more paid private military company troops on the ground than U.S. military troops. So it's happening throughout our social life, in health, in education, in civic life, the role of money in political campaigns. And what I'm suggesting is we need to step back and ask ourselves where money and markets serve the public good and where they don't belong.
Well, there's lots of views on this, I think, and some, the use of cash incentives to get some things going, some people think is a good thing if it's going to change behaviour.
Sure.
You give the example of reading. I think at the US, some childcare centres, parents are fined if they turn up late to pick their kids up, but also some schools where kids aren't reading very well, they're paid if they read a book. Right. Well, what's wrong with that?
The danger is that the money and the market values will crowd out or corrupt attitudes and values and norms worth caring about. So, for example, if we pay children $2 for each book they read, as has been tried in some places, the goal is worthy, to try to get kids to read more, especially if they come from disadvantaged backgrounds where reading is not a habit. But the danger is that the lesson being taught is that the reason to read is to make money. And if that's the lesson, then reading becomes a chore, like a form of piecework. And when the money stops, so may the reading.
Well, or is it a gamble that it might start off as a chore, but then it becomes a delight as the glories of reading are unfolded?
Well, if that actually happens, and I'm a big believer in looking and seeing what actually happens when we try these schemes, then I would be for it. Then my objection would recede. But what I'm suggesting is that too often we use market mechanisms and cash incentives without taking account of the fact that sometimes markets change the meaning of the goods being exchanged, especially in areas of teaching and learning, friendship, personal relations, the provision of health, civic duty and obligation. And I'm saying we need to have a morally robust public debate about how we value goods, what attitudes we want to encourage. But if the cash scheme, as you suggest, encourages the love of reading, in the end, if it takes, then I'm not doctrinaire. Then I think we should should try it.
I want to come to the moral debate, but of course there are also market failures, and I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but the cash scheme to encourage parents to pick up their kids from childcare on time actually failed. The pickups got worse, is that right?
That's right, it backfired.
Why would that be?
Well, it's interesting. Before, when parents came late, they felt guilty. They were imposing on the teacher who had to stay later with their child. But once there was a fine, they treated it as a fee for essentially a babysitting service. So more parents said, I'm willing to pay the amount. The guilt went away. So here's another example of where a market mechanism actually drives out certain attitudes and norms, and we have to decide how important is that.
And so, as you say, you're not necessarily doctrinaire about this.
Right.
But though in the introduction to your book, you seem a little more doctrinaire because you talk about the market mechanisms in carbon, which is one this country's been discussing now for several years. And, we put a price on carbon in Australia. Basically, companies can pay to pollute. But if that changes the mindset and raises awareness or consciousness about polluting, isn't that a good thing?
Yes, it is a good thing if that's the way it works. I'm very much in favor of a carbon tax. I think that's the best way of dealing with it. Carbon trading among companies domestically within a country has worked in some places, so I don't have a blanket objection to that. What I did object to was at the Kyoto Climate Convention, when the U.S. and other rich countries were insisting that they would only accept reductions in their emissions if they could be given the option either of reducing their own emissions or of paying other countries to reduce theirs. Here I think it's dangerous because it risks the idea of outsourcing sacrifice, risks undermining the shared global ethic and sense of responsibility for looking after the planet that we need to cultivate in the long term. So it may be, the mechanism may work domestically where companies are trading, but it may undermine a sense of shared responsibility and sacrifice at the global level.
There you go again, talking about the global ethic, trying to resuscitate that.
Yes.
You're listening to RM Breakfast. It's 21 minutes to 9. Our guest this morning is philosopher Michael Sandel. His latest book is called What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of the Market. Now, there's plenty of arguments. I'm sure you've got plenty of critics, certainly within the world of economics, but beyond, I'd say, that say you overlook the good that free markets can bring and that they have lifted people out of poverty, and that's why we have, global free trading to try and do that, and it has had that impact. But what you're concerned about is that those free market mechanisms are creeping into our everyday lives, not just goods that are bought and sold in a clear commercial sense. You're saying that's okay so long as we accompany that with the moral debate about it.
Yes.
What would be the centre of that moral debate? What would the key things we would be looking at?
Well, I want to first emphasize what you just now said. I am not arguing in my book, What Money Can't Buy, does not argue against market economies. It argues against the tendency of market economies to slide into market societies where we put a price tag on everything. That's my worry. And the moral debate I think we need to have is case by case, whether it's education or health or civic duty or personal life or family relations or paid pregnancy. We need to have a public debate about how these goods and social practices are properly valued. We shrink from those debates because they take us to a contested ethical terrain. We disagree about those questions, but I'm saying it's a mistake to shrink from them, because markets are not neutral instruments. That's really my point. They are tools, and they can be valuable and useful tools. But recently, over the past 3 decades, we've allowed this tool of the market economy to come to seep into and define our purposes throughout our social life. That's where I think we need a moral debate about the goods we prize and about the civic goods we need for democracy to flourish.
You also say that one part of, as that has risen, what has retreated is the notion of the good life in public discourse. I'm quoting you here. In hopes of avoiding sectarian strike, we insist citizens leave their moral and spiritual convictions behind when they enter the public square.
Right.
But in broad terms, isn't that a good thing if our politicians aren't there to insist or, let's say, ram their moral values down our throats?
I don't want them to ram their values down our throats, far from it. But what I do want is for citizens generally to engage in a morally more robust form of democratic public discourse than the kind we've become accustomed to. What we have these days throughout most democratic societies is tremendous frustration with the alternatives on offer from the major parties. And I think that's partly because either we're shouting at one another or politics is largely managerial and technocratic and uninspiring. And that's because I think there is, and there has crept in during the last 3 decades of market triumphalism, as I call it, our politics has become hollowed out. Our public discourse has been emptied of larger meaning and purpose. That's why we have the kind of narrow technocratic discussions that we have. So I'm trying to suggest that we need to lift up the terms of public discourse, to engage more directly with questions of justice and the common good and what it means to be a citizen. We will disagree, but we will also, I think, deepen democracy.
But do you think that the public, the electorate broadly wants that kind of debate about basic services and rights or economic decisions, that they would prefer to have it in a sense, as you say, a market instrument where, because the markets don't pass judgments on preferences, that they would prefer to have it without the value judgments of their politicians?
Well,
or do you think we're hankering for that kind of politician?
I think we want a richer, more morally robust politics. I think we're drawn, Fran, by the illusion that markets are value neutral and that they can solve our problems without requiring us to argue and deliberate together in public about big questions. But I think that's a false promise of the market faith. And I think it's led to our thinking that we can somehow outsource moral judgment and ethical debate to markets. I think that's been our mistake, and that's hollowed out our politics. I think there's a hunger in the public. I see it everywhere I go. For something more demanding.
That's an irony or contradiction in itself. You pull bigger and bigger crowds wherever you go, but in your country, this country, by and large, people are more and more affluent. Is that a contradiction?
Well, it may be a paradox, but I don't think it's a contradiction for the following reason. What I find is that what draws people to this enterprise, this activity of reasoning and arguing, debating about big questions together, is they don't get a chance to do that these days much in public discourse. There is a thinness and an emptiness. People sense they want public discourse to be about bigger things. And that,
don't we have more and more
attracts
avenues for that, given the new media, the new technologies? There's more and more chance for individuals to participate.
Yes and no. Only if there are forums, structured forums, occasions for meaningful deliberation about public things. Too much of what goes on in social media is in a few small number of characters, the number of words that can be used, sound bites carried over really into social media, or the hurling of epithets. There's a lot of ugly stuff on the internet, but potentially, I think, the internet and social media are enormous resources for public discourse. But it doesn't just happen on its own. It needs some form and direction and structure and purpose, and that's the responsibility, I think, of the media and also of institutions of higher education. We need to create forums and equip citizens for participation in this better, more demanding kind of public discourse.
One of the more odious examples that you gave in your book, which I wasn't aware of, goes to insurance. The notion of companies being... Now, you can explain this to me. I don't think I've got it quite clear in my head, but companies can in a sense gamble on someone's life, can't they?
Yes.
They can offer to pay their insurance premiums, but then the prize is they get the life insurance payout when that person dies. Tell us about that. Explain
Actually,
that to
this
us.
is one of the most striking examples. When you asked me early on what really struck me there, the insurance, life insurance, traditionally is to protect one's family in the event of an early death. But increasingly, it's being used as one financial instrument among others, big companies such as Walmart, many big banks, began taking out life insurance policies on their employees, not just the CEO, who might be expensive to replace if he or she died, but on maintenance workers, on janitors. And the money, when they die, goes not to the families, but to the companies. It's a form of a kind of a grim form of investment that's pretty close to a bet, a wager on death. And yet,
but I don't understand the point of it, because if it's not going to the family, why does the worker, the janitor in this case, even care if they have life insurance?
Well, in some cases they didn't even know.
Or is it just another market? It's just another market.
In many cases, they didn't even know. So what's happened is, it seems like an arcane area of insurance law, but during the last 3 decades, when markets have invaded almost every sphere of life, one of the areas they've invaded is the life insurance markets. So now there is a multi-billion-dollar industry in secondary life insurance policies, which, put in simple terms, means wagering on the death of strangers, on the lives and death of strangers. And in fact, now there are even on Wall Street death bonds, which are bundles of these secondary life insurance policies that underwriters, Wall Street firms, bundle, as they did for home mortgages not too long ago. They slice them and dice them and sell them off. And they see this, some Wall Street firms do, as a way of recovering from the losses they sustained when they tried to do this with home mortgages.
That's incredible. Now,
bonds.
By and large, you've accepted there is a difference, but beyond the sort of normal market mechanism and the way it's crept into elements of society we've been discussing.
Yeah.
But more broadly, are you surprised that the markets have marched on, the economic markets, financial markets have marched on since the global financial crisis and not retreated?
I think what's so surprising is that when the financial crisis hit, I think most of us assumed that this would mark the end of 3 decades of unquestioned market faith and market reach into every sphere of life, and that at last we would step back and have public debates in our societies about the proper role of markets, broadly speaking. But this hasn't happened. Now, in the years since the financial crisis, there was some regulatory reform, but no broader debate about what should be the role of money and markets in our lives. That's why I think citizens are still hungry for this debate, hankering for it, and yet we haven't had it. And I think the reason we haven't had it is that we are so reluctant to engage with big ethical questions in public discourse for fear of disagreement. I think we should overcome that impulse. It's the only way we're going to be able to decide what is the proper place of markets. And it's the only way I think we're going to have a richer, more substantive kind of democratic public discourse.
Michael Sandel, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast to Engage. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Fran.
Michael Sandel is a professor of government at Harvard University. His latest book is called What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And Michael Sandel will be speaking later this morning at the main stage of the Sydney Writers' Festival. If you happen to be in Sydney, you can head on down. I'm sure you could still get a seat. It's 10 minutes to 9 on Breakfast.
RN, your world unfolding.